On August 1st, 2025, the trade map between the United States and Canada changed overnight. Washington has imposed a sweeping 35% tariff on Canadian goods that fall outside the protection of the USMCA. A new 40% surcharge now looms over any shipment suspected of being rerouted through a third country, a move known as transshipment. For decades, the US and Canada have been each other's largest trading partners, moving hundreds of billions of dollars in goods every year. Now, a fresh wall of tariffs threatens to disrupt that flow and challenge industries on both sides of the border. This isn't just about government policy or political speeches. It's about supply chains, factory jobs, and the prices of everyday products that millions of people rely on. From border towns in Michigan to warehouse hubs in Ontario, the ripple effects are already starting to show. Some see this as a long-overdue correction to level the playing field. Others warn it could trigger a costly trade war with no quick winners. So the question is clear. Who will adapt? Who will suffer? And how soon will the impact reach you? In today's breakdown, we start by unpacking what this 35% tariff really means and why it matters more than you might think. The Rulebook, Trump Tariffs. 2025. How it really works. Under the Trump Tariffs 2025, any Canadian goods that do not qualify under the USMCA's rules of origin now face a 35% tariff at the U.S. border. This isn't a symbolic move. It applies to a wide range of products, from industrial metals and consumer electronics to processed foods that fail to meet the agreement's strict sourcing requirements. On top of that, shipments suspected of transshipment, meaning they're rerouted through another country to dodge the tariff, can be hit with an additional 40% surcharge. Customs and Border Protection has been given full authority to hold, inspect, and reclassify goods if they believe the origin rules have been bypassed. But here's the key detail. Not everything is on the chopping block. Roughly 85% or more of U.S.-Canada trade is still shielded by the USMCA's duty-free provisions. If a product can prove, with proper documentation, that it was substantially produced or assembled within the U.S., Canada, or Mexico, it remains tariff-free. This USMCA shield covers major sectors like automotive manufacturing, many agricultural goods, and high-value manufactured products. For exporters and importers, the challenge now is precision. One missing certificate of origin or an incomplete paper trail can turn a duty-free shipment into a costly one overnight. In short, the new rulebook isn't just about higher tariffs. It's about knowing exactly where your goods stand and proving it every single time they cross the border. Canada's quiet countermeasures, the silent pushback. While Washington made headlines with the Trump Tariffs 2025, Canada's response has been far more discreet, but no less impactful. In Ontario, the new procurement restriction policy quietly changed the rules for public sector contracts. It bars most U.S. suppliers from bidding on government-funded projects unless no Canadian or approved foreign alternative exists. This restriction extends to ministries, agencies, and infrastructure projects like bridges, transit systems, and even some hospital upgrades. For American construction firms, engineering companies, and equipment suppliers, the once open Ontario market has narrowed overnight. In the retail sector, the Liquor Control Board of Ontario, LCBO, made its own quiet move. Between March 5th and April 30th, 2025, sales of U.S.-made spirits at LCBO outlets plunged by roughly 66%. This was no random consumer shift. It followed a deliberate scaling back, and in some cases a complete halt, of purchases of American whiskey, bourbon, and other spirits. Shelf space was reallocated to Canadian distilleries and imports from Europe, Australia, and beyond. Because liquor sales in Canada are largely controlled by provincial authorities, this shift was entirely legal under trade rules. On the federal level, Ottawa added another layer, a 25% surtax on select U.S. goods starting March 4, 2025. The target list includes certain industrial products, consumer goods, and specialty foods. Individually, these measures may seem subtle, but together, they send a clear signal. Canada can apply pressure without public theatrics, steadily redirecting contracts, purchases, and consumer demand away from American suppliers. Data check. Canada's export diversification is underway. Beneath the headlines about tariffs and retaliation, the trade data tells a story of its own, and it's one that's been building for over a year. According to Statistics Canada, the share of Canadian exports headed to the United States has dropped sharply, from roughly 83% in mid-2024 to about 68 to 70% by May and June 2025. That's not a short-term fluctuation. It's a structural shift in where Canadian goods are going. The driving force is a deliberate push by Ottawa to reduce reliance on a single market. Over the past 12 months, Canadian trade officials have worked to strengthen ties with the European Union through the CETA framework, expand shipments to the United Kingdom post-Brexit, and deepen engagement with Asia-Pacific economies via the CPTPP. Southeast Asian markets, particularly Singapore, Vietnam, and Malaysia, have emerged as fast-growing destinations. At the same time, Canadian exporters are re-entering Latin America with renewed contracts in Mexico under the USMCA framework, balancing out some of the loss in U.S. market share. Several sectors are leading this diversification. Agri-food producers have ramped up sales of grains, pulses, and specialty crops to Asia and the Middle East. Advanced manufacturing, from aerospace components to green tech machinery, is finding new demand in Germany, Japan, and South Korea. The metals sector, especially steel and aluminum, is redirecting capacity toward NATO and EU partners seeking stable, high-grade supply. A 12-month export share chart would show the U.S. portion steadily shrinking, while Europe and Asia's bars climb higher. For Canada, this is more than a defensive move against U.S. tariffs. It's a long-term strategy to build resilience, bargaining power, and alternative growth paths in an unpredictable global economy. Impact by sector. Who hurts first? Who holds out? The Trump Tariffs 2025 have reshuffled the economic deck, creating distinct winners and losers on both sides of the border. In Canada, steel and aluminum producers are relatively well positioned. Backed by federal and provincial safeguards, they face less direct exposure to U.S. tariffs and have quickly redirected supply to NATO allies and EU markets seeking high-quality metals. For these industries, the disruption is an opportunity to lock in long-term contracts abroad, reducing dependence on U.S. buyers. But not all sectors can pivot so easily. Agricultural exporters, especially canola, specialty grains, and livestock products, remain heavily dependent on U.S. demand. For them, the 35% tariff is a direct hit to competitiveness, eroding margins and threatening farm incomes. The auto sector also faces serious pressure, as integrated supply chains mean components cross the border multiple times before final assembly. Any added cost or delay ripples through production schedules and pricing. On the U.S. side, beverage companies are among the hardest hit. Policies like Ontario's procurement restrictions and LCBO's pivot away from U.S.-made spirits have wiped out significant shelf space in a matter of months. Public works contractors are another casualty, shut out of lucrative Ontario infrastructure projects they once competed for aggressively. Meanwhile, U.S. industries that rely on Canadian metals, from construction to manufacturing, are dealing with higher input costs, squeezing profits, and raising prices for consumers. For everyday shoppers, this sectoral shakeup is already visible. The price of certain household goods, building materials, and imported foods is inching upward, while some products quietly disappear from store shelves. In the near term, the winners are those able to find alternative markets or suppliers quickly. The losers are tied to rigid supply chains and captive markets, where the cost of adaptation is high and the clock is already ticking. Jobs and states, the U.S. employment stakes. Behind the political headlines, the Trump Tariffs 2025 have a very human consequence: jobs. Roughly 8 million American jobs are directly tied to trade with Canada, according to recent data from Global Affairs Canada and the U.S. Census Bureau. These aren't abstract figures buried in an economic report. They represent auto workers on assembly lines, truck drivers hauling freight across border checkpoints, and skilled technicians in factories that rely on Canadian components. Michigan is among the most exposed states. Its auto industry depends heavily on cross-border parts flows, with components often crossing into Canada and back multiple times before a vehicle rolls off the line. Any delay or added cost from the 35% tariff can slow production, cut overtime, or even lead to layoffs. Ohio's chemical sector is another high-risk area, exporting specialty compounds to Canadian manufacturers and farms. Reduced orders could hit both wages and state tax revenues. In Texas, aerospace companies ship precision components to Canadian plants, while importing aluminum, avionics parts, and other materials for domestic assembly. These industries function as finely tuned systems. Disruptions on one side of the border ripple quickly to the other. An infographic map of the U.S. would show heavy concentrations of Canada-linked jobs along the Great Lakes, the northern border, and in key manufacturing hubs in the Midwest and South. While the tariffs are intended to protect American industries, they also place pressure on sectors deeply integrated with Canada's economy. For state leaders, the question isn't just about national trade policy. It's about protecting the livelihoods of millions of residents whose paychecks depend on a stable cross-border relationship. Politics and signals. CARNEY versus pressure. Inside the U.S., in Canada, Prime Minister Mark Carney has kept his message consistent. No deal is better than a bad deal. He frames the government's stance as a defense of national sovereignty and long-term economic stability, rather than a reactionary move in a political showdown. Recent polling from Angus Reid and Nanos shows his approach is resonating. Public approval of his handling of the U.S. trade standoff has climbed from 68% in late July to 71% in early August 2025. For many Canadians, the calm, deliberate tone signals that Ottawa is prioritizing domestic interests over short-term concessions. In the United States, however, the political atmosphere is far more fractured. Governors from border states like Michigan, Minnesota, and New York are pressing the White House for relief, warning that prolonged tariffs could cost thousands of jobs in industries tied to Canadian exports. Midwestern farm groups, already battling lower commodity prices, are voicing concerns about reduced Canadian purchases of corn, soy, and livestock products. Industry lobbies representing beverage producers, public works contractors, and manufacturers are joining the chorus, citing lost market access and rising input costs. The steel sector itself is split. Some producers welcome less competition from Canadian imports, while downstream manufacturers warn the protection comes at the expense of higher costs and tighter supply. These cross-currents paint a complex picture: solid political footing for Carney at home, growing economic anxiety in key U.S. constituencies, and a narrowing window for leaders on both sides to prevent the dispute from hardening into a long-term economic rift. Scenarios ahead. The next 30 to 90 days. The road ahead for U.S.-Canada trade will be shaped by choices made in the next 3 months. In the base case, Washington keeps the 35% tariff in place on all non-USMCA goods. Businesses on both sides adapt by tightening supply chains to meet rules of origin, while importers focus on sourcing products that qualify for duty-free status. Trade flows stabilize, but prices for targeted goods remain elevated, passing costs down to consumers. A de-escalation scenario could emerge if political and economic pressure builds in the U.S. This path might include sector-specific exemptions, for example, removing tariffs on certain agricultural products or industrial inputs, framed as technical adjustments rather than policy reversals. It could also involve cooperation with Mexico to rebalance flows under USMCA without the optics of retreat. The most volatile option is escalation. Washington could expand the tariff list to cover more product categories or tighten enforcement of the 40% transshipment surcharge, increasing inspections and penalties. Canada would likely counter with further procurement restrictions, targeted consumer market shifts, or expanded surtaxes. To anticipate which path becomes reality, several triggers need close monitoring. Updates from the Customs and Border Protection's CSMS will reveal changes in enforcement. Monthly trade data from Statistics Canada will show whether diversification away from the U.S. is accelerating or slowing. And developments in the Ontario procurement restriction policy will indicate if Canada is intensifying its quiet pushback. Whichever path unfolds, the next 90 days will set the tone for whether this tariff standoff becomes a drawn-out Cold War or begins to ease toward a fragile truce. The Trump Tariffs 2025 are not a total shutdown of U.S.-Canada trade. Roughly 85% or more of goods still move duty-free under the USMCA's protections, a powerful shield that keeps most cross-border commerce flowing. But for products outside that shield, the new 35% tariff, along with the 40% transshipment surcharge, represents a sharp increase in costs. These measures are already influencing supply chains, shifting contracts, and altering prices on both sides of the border. Canada's quiet countermeasures, from procurement restrictions to targeted consumer market changes, show that retaliation doesn't always come with loud headlines. Instead, it can happen in ways that steadily erode market access over time. The coming months will test the adaptability of industries, the resilience of supply chains, and the political will of leaders in Washington and Ottawa. For businesses and consumers alike, knowing where the USMCA line is and how to stay within it will be critical. So now, we turn it to you. Which scenario do you think will unfold in the next 90 days? Holding the line, stepping back, or pushing even harder? Share your thoughts in the comments and let's keep the conversation going.